were being distributed by agitators along the parade route in Dallas. Many were left lying in the streets after the assassination. These right-wing extremists handed these posters out, and I've got a reproduction back there. It tells you exactly what it looked like in the back there, kind of by the flag. If you had an original one, these are worth thousands of dollars if you can find them. Nobody can, they're not around. You can see similarities, but this particular one that looks just like this is impossible to find. Now, these were basically accusing the president of treason, and people handed these out. They were handing these out on the parade route. Now, obviously, when I say the people of Dallas were outspoken against President Kennedy's policies, is one of the reasons why they didn't want the president to go to Dallas. They were right, because these are things that were handed out during the motorcade route. So it shows that they were correct. These weren't out prior to him coming. They didn't see these and say, this is the reason we don't want him to go to Dallas. These actually were handed out the day he was in Dallas. So they were correct in their views. The other one was a black border ad, and I actually have an original right back up there by the tile of Kennedy, and they're very hard to find. And it was a welcome Mr. Kennedy to Dallas ad that was in the Dallas Morning News on Friday morning, November 22nd, 1963, which again was very, very critical of the president and his policies. The reason I show you these two handouts is because his aides were absolutely correct that the people of Dallas were outspoken against his policies and had good reason to tell him, hey, if we go to Texas, let's skip Dallas. You see the reasons why? They don't want to see another. Were they fearing for his life? No, they were fearing for a humiliation that Adlai Stevenson had faced in UN Day. They were thinking the crowds would be disrespectful to him, maybe throw things at him, or maybe yell things at him that weren't appropriate. And all of his aides said, man, you know, Kennedy himself said the morning that they went to Dallas, he said to Jackie, well, we're going into nut country today. Because people were very outspoken, and they were expecting the worst when he got into Dallas. Well, after listening to the concerns of his staff and advisors, President Kennedy simply disagreed. He didn't think that he could go to the state of Texas and skip Dallas, which was the second largest city in the state. He just told them, I get it, but we're going to Dallas. And then what happened then? His aides in the Secret Service had to do what? Make preparations for what may happen. Okay? Now let me tell you why, another reason he went to Texas. President Kennedy's approval rating had dropped from 76% to 59% prior to this trip. Why was his approval rating dropping? What did people not like that he was doing? Think. Come on. Civil rights, that a girl. The South was against him because of his stand for civil rights. And his popularity dropped from 76% to 59%. And he knew that he might be in a close race for president in 64. Guess who his likely opponent would have been in 64? Familiar name. You girls and boys from the LDS Church ought to get this one. Who was the LDS candidate against Bush? Or against Obama, excuse me. Mitt Romney, right? Well, his father, George Romney, who was a senator from Michigan, was going to be Kennedy's top competition in 64. And his approval rating had dropped from 76% to 59%. And he knew that George Romney was going to give him a run in 64. And he had believed that he had to go to Dallas, and he had to put on a good show there, and he had to get the governor of Texas on the same wavelength as the senator and the vice president, or he wasn't going to win Texas. And if he didn't win Texas, he was certain that Romney would beat him in 64. Does that all kind of make sense to you why he went to Texas? Because it's really important that you understand why he even went there in the first place. Okay, let's talk about the Texas agenda. What's he going to do in Texas? Okay, what's the plan? Well, we're going to tell you the whole story first. Okay, so once Kennedy had made up his mind that he was going to visit Dallas, they set up a 2-day agenda there for the president. Okay, now I'll tell you what his agenda was for the Texas trip, though, because he was there more than that time. On Thursday, November 21st, 1963, the day before he went to Dallas, he would depart Washington, D.C. and fly to Texas, first to San Antonio, and then to Houston. So this is the Texas agenda. On Thursday, November 21st, 1963, Kennedy would depart Washington, D.C., would fly to Texas. He would first fly into San Antonio, and then he would fly into Houston. And he would ride in motorcades and give speeches in both of those cities. That's on the 21st, okay? It's on the 21st. Now, his speech in Houston would be late in the evening on the 21st. After he gave that speech in Houston, he was going to fly to Fort Worth, Texas, and stay there overnight. Okay? So, Kennedy is going to give speeches on the 21st of November in both San Antonio and Houston. His Houston speech would run late into the night. And after his speech in Houston, he was going to fly to Fort Worth, Texas, and stay the evening. That's the 21st. The 22nd is the agenda most people remember. And I'll tell you what his agenda was on the 22nd. And most people think that all he did is go to Dallas the 22nd. That's not true. One of the more famous things he did on the 22nd was what happened in Fort Worth. Okay? Now, here's the order of his agenda for Friday, November 22nd, 1963. This is what would have happened if it had gone like it should have. First of all, Kennedy would be attending a morning breakfast and giving a speech for the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. So his first duty of the 22nd, is he was going to get up, he was going to attend a morning breakfast at the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth and give a speech there. So his first order of business on the 22nd would be to attend a morning breakfast speech and speak at the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth. And he was going to give that speech right at the Hotel Texas where he was staying that night. So they flew in late from Houston, he stayed overnight, and the speech was going to be given in the grand ballroom of the Hotel Texas where he was staying that night. Wasn't leaving the hotel for that speech. After his speech in Fort Worth, he was going to make a very short flight to Dallas and land at Love Field. After his speech in Fort Worth the morning of the 22nd, the president would make a short flight to Dallas and he would land at Love Field. Once they landed at Love Field, they would ride in a motorcade, and it would be an 11-mile motorcade trip from Love Field through downtown Dallas. So once he landed at Love Field from Fort Worth, he would get in a motorcade. Presidential limousine was flown in, and the presidential motorcade would be an 11-mile route from Love Field through downtown Dallas. That motorcade would end then at the Trade Mart, which is on your ID sheet. Would end at the Trade Mart, where President Kennedy would address 2,500 luncheon guests and give a lunch speech at the Trade Mart. Now, if you want to know what the Trade Mart is, it's kind of like the Rimrock Auto Arena in Billings or the Casper Events Center. It was that type of a facility, okay? Wasn't so much for sports, but it was that type of facility. So, the motorcade would ride an 11-mile motorcade trip through downtown Dallas. It would end up at the Trade Mart, where President Kennedy was going to address with a speech 2,500 luncheon guests. Once the president finished his luncheon speech, he would then depart Dallas and fly to Austin, Texas, the capital, where he was scheduled to speak at a $100 a plate dinner that evening. So after his luncheon speech at the Trade Mart in Dallas, he would catch a flight. Air Force One would fly him to Austin, Texas, where he was scheduled to speak at a $100 a plate dinner. If you're interested, that'd be about $781 today. So everybody that went there paid $781 to listen to him speak. So what is it? It's a Democratic fundraiser, right? So he's campaigning. Well, after he gave his speech in Austin, he would then depart Austin. They would take a helicopter and fly to Stonewall, Texas, and spend the night at Vice President Johnson's ranch. That was the president's agenda for November 22nd, 1963. He would attend a breakfast speech for the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth. He would depart Fort Worth and make a short flight to Dallas, landing at Love Field. He would land at Love Field in Dallas and ride in an 11-mile motorcade trip through downtown Dallas. It would end up at the Trade Mart where President Kennedy would address 2,500 luncheon guests. He then would fly from Dallas to Austin where he was scheduled to speak at a $100 a plate dinner in Austin. And they would take a helicopter flight from Austin to Stonewall, Texas, and he was going to spend the night at Vice President Johnson's ranch. That was his agenda. Where did it end? Anybody know in this agenda where it ended? During the very end of the motorcade route. They had gone almost the entire 11 miles and were from here probably to the office from taking the Stemmons Freeway that would have put him on the freeway to take him to the Trade Mart. So any danger that he would have faced would have been during that 11-mile route, and he was at the very end. Again, but probably from here to the main office distance from getting the limousine on the Stemmons Freeway and been to the Trade Mart, just so you know. Okay, so that's where it is. All right, so let's tell you a little bit about what happened in San Antonio, Texas, because we're going to go on his agenda now. It's a great story. Not very many people know this story, and I think it's so important that you know what he did prior to the assassination. What did he do in San Antonio, Texas? Well, we're going to get to that, yep, but I want to tell you a little something before that. I did tell you about Mrs. Kennedy they lost their baby Patrick, right? We talked about that. Well, among the passengers that would be traveling to Texas with President Kennedy on this trip would be Mrs. Kennedy. She had not traveled with him since his election. It's the first time she had traveled in a long period of time with him, and he really wanted her to go. So she decided, despite the fact that probably she rather would have not gone, she chose to go with him, and it was the first time she had traveled with him since election day. So on Thursday morning, November 21st, President Kennedy, his staff, and his wife left Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland for the trip to Texas. They landed at 2:30 p.m. on November 21st and met at the airport Vice President Johnson, who had flown into Texas earlier that week. So the thing to keep in mind here, because it'll become important later, is Lyndon Johnson did not fly with President Kennedy to Texas. He met him in San Antonio because he had been there earlier. He flew in earlier. So President and Mrs. Kennedy arrive in San Antonio at 2:30 p.m. on November 21st, and they're met by Vice President Johnson, who had flown to Texas earlier in the week. Now, you were a little ahead of me, but you weren't quite correct there. Once he landed in San Antonio, President Kennedy got in that motorcade, and the motorcade took him to Brooks Air Force Base. So he did not land at Brooks Air Force Base. He landed at a normal airport in San Antonio, and they rode a motorcade to Brooks Air Force Base, where he inspected a new aerospace medical center and gave a speech. That was the idea, right? He's going there to visit military installations. So they land at 2:30, they get off into their limousine, and they motorcade to Brooks Air Force Base, and he inspects a new aerospace medical center there, and then eventually gives a speech at the Air Force Base. Well, they were on a very tight schedule. We'll end with this today. They were on a very, very tight schedule, so there was no room for extra stuff, really. Well, President Kennedy had heard that they were doing an experimental procedure at a different location on the base. And he all of a sudden wanted to go see that. He wanted to see this new experimental procedure that they were performing at Brooks Air Force Base, which took him off the schedule, but it's kind of like, you're the President of the United States, they will wait for you, right? He determined he wanted to go check out this experimental procedure that was being done at a different location on the base, and that's what they did. Now, he had a personal interest in this experimental procedure, and he wanted to observe it in person. And then we'll end to tell you what it was about. Anybody want to guess maybe what they were doing? Why it'd be personal to him? I'd be really impressed if you could pull this off. But what might be near and dear to his heart concerning what happened to him tragically not too long before that? What happened to him tragically? What's that? Well, it's a good guess, but what not happened to him? What happened to it? Yeah, he lost his son. Why did Patrick Bouvier Kennedy die? Premature, but what was his problem? Why did he, what were so premature that he couldn't survive?
His lungs.
His lungs. Well, this was an experimental procedure to test the effects of pure oxygen on a person's lungs. And he was interested in that because he wanted to know if that was successful in there, if they could, transfer that to the medical field and maybe have prevented something like the death of his son. So this experimental procedure that they were trying, that he wanted to see so bad, was a procedure designed to test the effects of pure oxygen on a person's lungs. And basically what they did, just so you know, is 4 volunteers that were members of the Air Force were locked in chambers to see how they reacted to breathing in pure oxygen. So these guys were in this chamber, sealed tight, and they were pumping pure oxygen into them to see how that would affect their lungs. So you had to be a little bit courageous to even volunteer for such a duty, and Kennedy wanted to see that. Okay, we'll end with that today and tell you about his watching this experimental procedure and the impact he made on some of the people that were there, and then it's leaving San Antonio and going to Houston. And we'll just continue on this for a long time. And you'll be very well versed. You can argue with your college professors like many of my former students do.